Yep, looks like we're live. Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. Sorry about a little delay. We had some technical issues, but today is going to be a very fascinating discussion. So I'm just going to give you guys a brief background about why I decided to have this discussion. If you guys remember, after the elections in the first, congregation of the NDA in the parliamentary hall, there was a particular moment that had, led to a certain discussion online. It was basically when Narendra Modi was about to go to make his speech to the members of the NDA. He basically did a particular gesture. He went out, he bowed down to the Constitution, and then he went ahead and made his speech. That led to a lot of discussions. It led to a lot of opinions on different sides. But I think one opinion that stood out for me was my friend Jai Sai Deepak's article, which he wrote on the first post, which was titled "The Romanticism of the Constitution." I really loved that article. I had shared it at that time also, and the moment I read that article, I had actually contacted Sai and I told him that, you know what, I need to talk to you about this article because the points you raise in the article are actually very interesting, and they were things that I've been thinking about too. I mean, what does the Constitution mean to us? So, I'm glad he agreed. So, Sai, welcome to the podcast. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Kushal. Thank you for having me. I think it's a pleasure to talk to you always. So let's see how this goes.
All right. So let's start with this. What made you write that article? I have my reasons to, think about this subject, but I wanted to understand a priori, when you saw Narendra Modi doing that gesture of bowing down to the Constitution, what were the thoughts that went into your head, and why did you think, no, I need to write about this? So I need to understand the background of first. Why did you decide to write about it?
Actually, it was not his gesture that triggered the thought to write a piece on that issue. It was the multiple interpretations and diverse reactions that came out after the gesture, where people were trying to read a lot into it, and it was also being interpreted to mean that no constitutional amendment or change is possible. That's when I thought that perhaps this deserves some kind of a clarity, if not a response, to tell people what I thought or what I continue to think is the manner in which the Constitution is supposed to be read. See, I've always maintained one thing. There is only one person who knows what Narendra Modi ji actually thinks, and that is Narendra Modi himself and himself alone and nobody else. Okay? So the rest of us go crazy trying to interpret every gesture and every symbol. Okay? And that really makes no sense according to me. Of course, you can try and understand if he's trying to send a message. And given his position, given his reach, it's impossible to look for symbolism in his gestures, okay, or a message in his gestures. But should we be indulging in this like, let's say, fans of a superstar from movies, or should you go about it in a very objective way, trying to understand what is it that we must be expecting from this government, and what are the deliverables, and whether that gesture has any bearing on those deliverables. Okay, I think that is what we must approach this issue with. That business-like approach is very, very important. Otherwise, it could end up becoming another cult. And I don't think Mr. Modi personally likes the concept of a personality cult. Because if he's against the concept of a dynasty, he must be even more against the concept of an individual run cult. Okay. So I don't think he appreciates people who act like fans or followers as opposed to thinking independent individuals. Okay. And since he welcomes criticism, he welcomes inputs, and he expects active participation. That is what I think we must be doing. Of course, I'm no one to tell people what they must do or pontificate to them what is right and wrong. I'm merely sharing my views. So that's my thought.
All right, so let's start with the first paragraph of your article. So I'm just going to read the first few lines where you start with words like every value, concept, construct, ideology, language, or even faith, no matter how universal or universalist it may be or claims to be, necessarily goes through a process of nativization. And I like how you have started this conversation because it's very interesting, because usually discussions in the West, especially in the United States of America, when it comes to what does the Constitution mean to the Republicans and the Democrats, and I'm just using this as an analogy, I'm not using it to map it on the context of India, because your line itself says that and your article does go into detail about how we have to interpret constitutional democracies in a very localized way. and I kind of agree with you on that. But if we would to use the American analogy, where the discussion between the Republicans and the Democrats has always been very interesting, where the Democrats use this very interesting word. They call it a living, breathing document, right? They say it's a document that constantly evolves, can evolve, including the so-called core, rights, which are the First Amendment, Second Amendment, etc., etc. And the Republicans push back on that. They say that these are natural laws, natural rights with divine acceptance. Basically, that's the Republican argument. Now, if we were to look at it from an Indian context, what I found was that the usual. I mean, there were many layers in it. I mean, let us look at the political layer to start with. I mean, the political layer has always been with, with the BJP. The opposition has always accused the BJP that the BJP is out to destroy constitutional democracy, or India is going to become a fascist country. So, if you look at it from a purely political messaging point of view, here was a leader who's got such a big mandate. He goes around and does a very Indian thing. I mean, bowing down to things itself is a very desi thing. I mean, you will not see people from other cultures bowing down to constitutions, but exactly. He did that. So he did that, and you mentioned that in your article, and you create that nuance itself. Now, do you think from a political point of view, isn't that a very good message to people who accuse him of wanting to destroy democracy itself?
Right. So I think that is the limited extent to which that gesture was meant to convey the message. Okay. Which is to basically say, you have portrayed me as someone who is a Hitler in the making, and who once achieves the pinnacle of power will rob this country of any semblance of democracy and constitutionalism and destroy the spirit of this document, is the accusation that you have leveled against me for all these years, ever since I have stepped into active political life. Okay. And I want to convey the message that this is not me. I think that is the limited extent to which that gesture is meant to be interpreted. That is the only thing that he wanted to convey. Okay. But the Gangotris and the Yamunotris and the tributaries that we built over that particular gesture is astounding. Okay. And therefore, to the extent that he bowed to it, it was the Indian way of respecting the Constitution, perhaps, the Indic way. That is why I said that this is the nativized or localized feel that you have when it comes to the Constitution. But that is not necessarily going to translate to elevating it to the status of a divine document which is immutable and transcendental, or let's say, which is incapable of any change or immune to any change. Okay. So that, I think, I'm not sure how many people understood it, because I do believe that there are a certain set of people who want to cast that particular document in stone and thereby create a justification for not doing anything concrete on that particular front. Okay. And on the other hand, some people are interested in casting it in stone to ensure that the government has no option but to toe their line. Okay. So these are multiple, let's say, nuances at play. Now, when it comes to the point that you mentioned about the Republicans seeing it as a divine document, you're 100% correct on that particular front. It is almost similar to the Roman Catholic conception of a constitution, wherein they believe that it is their manifest destiny, and therefore it is a document that has flown from the God, not the gods, but from the God. Okay. And therefore, it is an assertion of their belief that they are the chosen people in a certain sense. Okay. And when the Democrats say that it is a living, breathing document, while they do justice to the fluidity of the document, thanks to its own nature, it's true to its nature. What they also do is they play a very subtle chicanery, which is to say that we will keep changing it according to our world value and our world views and our perspectives, by using the context, by using the pretext that it is a living, breathing document and therefore must be fluid. So there is a sense of opportunism even in the democratic position. Okay. I am basically saying that there is a combination of two things. One, that the concept of a constitution is meant to reinforce the idea of republicanism as opposed to monarchy or dynasty. Okay. And therefore, the idea is to reinforce that it is the will of the people that must prevail and must be respected. And that is the spirit and essence of a constitutional democracy. Okay. Second is to basically say the document must keep pace with times. Okay. And must ensure that one particular values are not foisted on all generations for all times to come. That's it. These are the two broad pillars. And someone rightly pointed out to me, and this is something that I hadn't observed in that particular sense, saying that this is how the Shrutis and Smritis are actually to be understood. Okay, Shruti is basically what is received as revelation, but it is basically identification of a goalpost, whereas Smriti defines what is the manner in which you achieve that particular goalpost, and that is tailored to the times you live in. Which is why when somebody says that this Smriti is applicable to this particular age or yuga, then they basically say it is time specific. One Smriti cannot apply across all timelines. Okay, which is why there is a raging debate whether Manusmriti is the right Smriti to be applied in the Kali Yuga at all in the first place. Some people believe it's not Manusmriti, it happens to be the Parashara Smriti. I am not an expert on Dharma Shastra, so I can't comment beyond that. But that is the same analogy you apply to the constitution as well. You have certain goalposts, but it must be left to people to change the manner in which they wish to achieve it, and also define those values according to the time they live in.
All right, then my next question, which will be a natural question to you, is that okay, we get it, but by merely saying that constitutional democracy is a non-negotiable, which is pretty much what comes out through your article too, that what you're trying to say is that okay, there is
Right.
one non-negotiable that we agree on, that we want to remain a democracy, and in a democracy the best way of governing or deciding how or setting the rules of the game per se has to be a constitution, and that's what we agree on. First of all, that's a good thing that at least both sides can agree on that thing. But then where the difference, and I'm just trying to play the devil's advocate here, is that where the difference could lie is that good enough? Where a person like me would, and I'm trying to play both sides here, where both sides try to play it this way. In India, I don't know what both sides are, honestly, and we keep using the term both sides as if there are two sides. I mean, I think India has multiple sides, where the Indian nation, which is so plural and diverse in its own way, I think has struggled, is that beyond the non-negotiable of us being a secular, let's not even use the word secular, a democratic republic or a constitutional democracy, we've not been even able to decide the contours of what defines freedom in a country like India. Like in a mature democracy like America, which has been a democracy now for almost 300 years, now they have defined their non-negotiables very well. Like what it means to be free in the United States of America, what is freedom in the United States of America, what is freedom of expression. They have robust discussions and robust clarity when it comes to that. Whether it's the First Amendment, whether it's the Second Amendment, there is a lot of discussion on that. My fear is when we only declare democracy as the non-negotiable and a constitution being a way of functioning within that democracy, my fear is that sometimes it could lead to a kind of a confusion where I think it is not good enough. Personally, I believe that the pure aim of a democracy has to be ensuring freedom for its citizens. Because what is a constitution? It is the will of the people of that country, right? At the end of the day, or it's supposed to be the will of the people of that country. In the case of our country, I mean, it was just a bunch of people who just did a cut, copy, paste job. Yes, there were fierce debates, but beyond a point, it was cut, copy, paste. So was it the will of the people? And is that the reason we keep on amending our constitution? Do you think because we've been failing to actually reflect the will of the people in this country that we keep on amending our constitution?
You've touched upon quite a few issues that afflict the common perception about the Constitution. Okay, so let me point out one by one what those issues are. So after I wrote this piece on a WhatsApp group, as usual, which has turned out to be, I think, one great time buster, is I got a comment from someone who said, why do you think that this constitution reflects the will of the people? Who was consulted? How was it even reflective of the will of the people at the time that it was crafted and drafted? So I said, okay, do you understand the concept of a constituent assembly? That's one. Now, how do you think that people were elected to that assembly? Were there elections that were held before 1946 or in 1946 or not? Okay, so if those elections were held and people did vote, and these people who were members of the Constituent Assembly reflected the will of the people who cast votes and who sent them to that particular office, then are you saying that they do not have, or they did not have, the right to speak on behalf of their electoral mandate. Okay, that's one. Second is, today it has become common to expect public comments on every policy decision, okay, and on every constitutional decision. But that was not the case even 30 years ago or 40 years ago. The concept of having a town hall, or let's say inviting comments from the public on any major policy decision, was almost alien to this country. Okay. And if that was the case 30, 40 years ago, I don't think that was the case in 1946, from 1946 to 1950. Okay. So therefore, if we use the values of current day participatory policy making and foist it on what was happening between 1946 and to 1950, then there is a problem that we may forget what exactly was treated as the norm for policy making in those times. Okay, I am not justifying uh, any position where somebody has not deemed it fit to reach out to the public and ask them, is this the constitution that you're happy with? Maybe that is something that they ought to have done considering the circumstances in which it was being drafted. Okay, that's something that could have happened. However, here's my question. The American Constitution, I think, does not go beyond 15-20 pages. But even those 15-20 pages, where they put out in public domain for comments from the citizens of United States when it was being put together, if that is the case, did the founding fathers reach out to people? How did they do so? Okay, of the US. I'm not sure even the kind of participatory policy making that we see even in the United States today, or even to the level of India today, was done when the American Constitution was framed. Okay, so I think that assumption effectively, or that particular point effectively, detracts attention from what was the norm then. Today, the norm of policy making has changed. So that's point number one. Point number two is, I do understand the sentiment when people say that the Indian Constitution is largely a cannibalized document with multiple fathers, foreign fathers, so to speak. Ho sakta hai. Okay. But legally, what is assumed, and it is standard practice, that if there is something that exists in a good form somewhere, okay, then there is no harm in adopting it and using it as an inspiration, provided that Indian values are read into that document, okay, so that it goes through the process of what I call nativization. Okay. However, merely because it has been imported from somewhere, if the spirit of that particular import is also foisted here slavishly, then an alien value or an alien definition of an existing value is imposed on Indians. That is where the problem starts. And that is why you have a problem with how secularism is interpreted in this country. Okay. And what is even surprising is that word was not even imported at the time of its drafting. It came out only in 1977. Right. So this is point number two. Point number three is, see, where the problem starts is Indians behave like new converts when it comes to democracy and constitutional democracy. Okay. Which is, they are so rigid and militant that they have made a religion out of constitution. Okay. When in fact, both are perhaps antithetical in that particular sense, in the manner in which they're supposed to be approached. If the Supreme Court is of the view that religion itself must keep pace with times and must let go of its orthodoxy and traditions, I'm sure the Supreme Court itself cannot say that the Constitution must be applied, or the different standards must be applied to the Constitution, which is a man-made document and which is meant to be fluid and let's say breathing, as you call it. Okay. I would largely put my finger on one central problem: is too many people having too many opinions on the Constitution without actually having read the document. Okay. And most importantly, the document in itself cannot do justice merely because the document is the subject of interpretation by a body. That effectively means that you have to read some judgments to understand how a certain document has been read, because it has certain rules of interpretation, right? It is not up for any kind of interpretation, right? You, even if you want to apply the principles of Mimamsa to the Constitution, even then you must admit that there are some rules that apply to it. Okay. So therefore, the Constitution's language is clear. However, if there are a certain set of rules that apply to it in the manner in which it is supposed to be read, interpreted, construed, and applied or enforced, then you have to have both. Now, when somebody says, let us spread more constitutional awareness, I'm completely for it. I'm 100% for it, because more people need to know about it. Okay. But even then, I would be very clear about saying that not everybody is going to make sense of it in the manner in which it is supposed to be, because it is a specialized area. That much is something that I have to admit. Okay. Now, this is not the ego of a lawyer or the condescending tone of a lawyer speaking. Okay. Just as a former engineer, I would say that kindly don't comment on things on science if you're not qualified to do so. I would make the same statement with respect to law as well, because notwithstanding the fact that it is meant for everybody's consumption, or it is meant to apply to everyone, not everyone can be expected to understand it. That is a fact. Okay. So आज की डेट में इंटरनेट पे you've got so many things coming up with respect to medicine, e-medicine. Can every one of us claim to be as efficient and proficient and expert as doctors? I don't think that's something that we should allow, right? That would be too dangerous. Democratization of knowledge does not mean that you dumb down the concept altogether. Okay. So the one final point I'd like to make in response to your question is, people are bound to look at the Constitution not just in the manner in which it's supposed to be read, but through their own worldview, through their own perspectives and ideology. Okay. And that is something that will go on for eternity. And I don't think even America today has any kind of clarity on its own constitutional values, because the one issue that is going to come up for serious, I think, cogitation before the Supreme Court is whether private restaurants and bars have the right to not serve homosexual couples. Okay. That is a question that they are going to address. And a lot of people see that Trump's appointment of 2 conservative Supreme Court judges is bound to have a bearing on this particular issue. So you see that it's not just about what is right and wrong, but you're able to draw a nexus between a political appointment of someone with a certain ideological hue and its bearing on an issue for consideration. That is the nexus. That is the crucible. Okay. So I also don't believe that India is an immature democracy, because I don't think any country has the kind of diversity and the kind of issues that we've had, and the emotional baggage and the historical baggage that we continue to carry. And yet, for us to have survived as a constitutional democracy for all these years itself is a huge achievement that we always undervalue and we underrate. That is something that we must respect. Therefore, the Constitution's fundamental function of ensuring that Sardar Patel's efforts do not go in vain, and you still have one political unit, okay, which stands as one unit to the rest of the world, it has succeeded in doing so largely, barring Article 370. Okay. So I would still say that every constitution in the most mature of democracies is still a work in progress, because that is the nature of the document. India may be slightly behind the curve on certain things, but I think we are reaching there, provided we start having really enlightened, aware, and sane discussions on the Constitution, as opposed to turning that into an entirely political discussion. Congress did this, BJP did this, so what? Forget Congress or BJP. The question is, what do you do within the framework of the Constitution? That is the question. Sorry, your voice is not audible, Kushal.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest reason I wanted to talk to you about this. And this is the specific reason. These last words that you use, that in India everything is sullied because of political tribalism. In that sense, it's
Correct.
always about, oh, tum kis party se ho, you're from X party, you're from Y party, and I think there are certain fundamental questions that are beyond political parties, that are beyond because they affect each one of us. I mean,
correct.
And this is where my fear lies, that every time we have these kinds of discussions in India, I mean, look, my background is I'm a philosophy nut. So I look at everything not from a legal point of view, but actually from a philosophical point of view. For me,
Right.
It is all about what is the philosophical answer. So how would I look at it from an ethical, moral point of view? And I think that is also an important factor in discussions like this. We need to look at the ethics of constitutional democracy itself. And what I get confused every time is, and this is connected to, because you mentioned this in the article too, that the basics of the Constitution, like the fundamental nature of the Constitution itself, is so confusing in India. I mean, to refer to a specific area where, you talk about the Keshavananda Bharati case. So, can you explain what are the limits of the power of democracy in a country like India? Because I'm not able to understand at a philosophical level what is the limit of power and where does the state draw its power. Because if we talk about India being a constitutional democracy, in the constitution itself, when you read, I mean, I'm not saying I've read the whole thing, but I've read far more than the average human being has, because it was something that I was interested in. And there are some really draconian laws in the constitution itself.
Right.
So how does that constitution serve any purpose when it comes? Because if it's the will of the people, is it really the will of the people? Let's take the blasphemy law. I know it's everybody's like, oh, shuru ho gaya Kushal, but I have to use it as an example because this is a dharmic society where no blasphemy existed and it has a blasphemy law. Now, when do we tackle these issues? So when we define the basic structure of the constitution also, do you think, as an expert in the subject, have we done a good job in this nation?
Right. So just so that we have a clear map forward, just make a note of the three heads that I will answer this question under. The first head would be, why is this blessed document such a lengthy document? Do we need such a huge constitution in the first place? Is that one of the central issues? That's one. Okay. Second is, what is the ideological mold of this constitution? Is it Judeo-Abrahamic in nature or is it dharmic in nature? That's the second question. The third question flows from these two, which is whether this constitution has empowered democracy or has it fettered democracy? Okay. And whether the Supreme Court has put fetters on democracy through the introduction of the basic structure doctrine. Okay. These are the three questions. Okay. So let me start with the first question. I had one gentleman say, "Arey, America mein to sirf 15 page ka hai, 20 page ka hai. Why do we need such a huge constitution for India?" Okay. Because we had so many princely states which had acceded to India, and all of those accessions were consequences of negotiations between the princely state and the Indian Union. Okay. Their interests had to be accommodated. Okay. Their genuine concerns had to be accommodated, and they had to make certain concessions to the Indian Union. This much is something that I have learned after handling the Padmanabha Swamy case, where the entire history of the relationship between the princely state of Travancore and the Indian Union was something that I had to go through. Okay. And I realized how complex these issues were. Okay. Once you do this, here's the situation. Someone who was a sovereign and a king has been asked to merge with a union and give up his sovereignty over that entire piece of land. And several states in this country were as big as several countries in European Union. Okay. So, and they were so rich, and you're asking them to give up such a huge fiefdom for all practical purposes for eternity with minimal guarantees, right? That is why Indian federalism, when the discussion happens, needs to take into account this historical fact. Okay. So that you see what is the extent of power that the state retains to maintain its individual identity. Okay. And also functions as part of an indispensable unit. Okay. Therefore, our entire understanding is that the Indian Union is an indispensable union of fungible units, meaning thereby that you are entitled to break up these independent states the way the center wants. Imagine getting that kind of a concession under the Indian Constitution from the princely states. Okay. So there, I think Sardar Patel and VP Menon, his right hand, effectively did a fantastic job of ensuring that these people were taken on board, and this was almost bloodless, barring Kashmir and Operation Polo in Hyderabad for reasons which are well known, okay, and are common. Okay. Now, point number two is, since you're undertaking the creation of a political unit called Bharat for the very first time, you may have existed as a civilizational unit, but not as a political unit, except for empires here and there. Okay. You had to effectively tell people what is the daira of their expectation and their rights when they are part of this union. Okay. So, to my mind, the length of the document was perhaps necessary, because it had to address different aspects of administration, both external and internal, so that people know where they stand in the scheme of things, and they don't feel that they've merged into this Mahasagar to lose their independent identities as drops and droplets. This is the first thing that we have to understand. Okay, so and it's not as if, let's say, 15 or 17 states in the United States, they decided to come together where there were not too many racial divides, or there were not too many linguistic divides, or there were not too many religious divides or cultural divides. This is a different country altogether. Okay, so therefore the length of the document is something that we need to consider. That's point number one. Point number two is, I don't think that this particular document was meant to be treated as having Judeo-Abrahamic traditions as its foundations. Okay, I don't think we subscribe to that at all, because neither Judaism nor any other Abrahamic faith is native to this land. Okay, and therefore our jurisprudence does not source its principles and values and concepts from any Judeo-Abrahamic tradition. That is the basic assumption. That over time we have started doing so is a corruption. That's a different issue altogether. Okay, however, when these people decided to import certain concepts for the sake of convenience and expedience, they did not decide to foist foreign values on us. Okay, even Dr. Ambedkar was clear that when he was importing free speech, he wasn't importing, he was importing from within, because he believed that India does not need to learn the concept of free speech from anywhere else at all. Okay, the fetters that were put on free speech were by the Nehruvian dispensation. Okay, not by the Ambedkar dispensation as far as the drafting is concerned. This is something that we have to understand. And I think Anand Ranganathan has cited quite a few examples to support this particular proposition, right? At the very least, he has cited about 200 examples, right, as to how this Nehruvian dispensation has played itself out to the detriment of free speech and other values. So that's point number two. Point number three is the fetters on democracy, the limits on democracy. See, the thing is, the Constitution, if you think of it as a social contract where people say, we are willing to surrender some of our freedoms at the altar of the greater good because we have to function as a society and the country, okay, then it is a self-imposed fetter to that extent. Okay, because you see a certain value in it, you see a certain compromise which is good for everyone, beneficial. Okay, but what the basic structure doctrine did, it has its pros and cons. And you must realize that while it was delivered before the emergency, I'm sure people would have started seeing dictatorial signs from 1971 onwards. Okay, when Indira Gandhi was up and alive and she was kicking and she was at her peak, at her helm. Okay, so I'm sure most people would have known that looks like we have to do something to protect the constitution and democracy from this authoritative dictatorial person who brooks no competition, no challenge, even from a constitutionally appointed guardian of the Constitution. Okay, so that is the context in which I think this particular doctrine was deemed necessary. But as I said before, if more people were to preside on the bench and they decide to revisit the basic structure doctrine, then what do? Then you will use the Constitution to overturn what was deemed to be constitutionally necessary. Okay, that is always possible. I will never put anything away outside the realm of possibility, outside the pale of possibility. Okay, now here's where the catch lies. You're a democratic country. The will of the sovereign, therefore the will of the people, is everything, and yet you have chosen to surrender certain issues to an unelected body, which is the Supreme Court. Okay, where you have zero role to play effectively, and certainly after the judge's case, the institution of the collegium, you have zero role to play. Okay, I don't agree with the judgments of the collegium cases, because I believe that they have undermined Article 124 of the Constitution. It was not meant to be a club deciding its own successors. Okay, that is something that I've been very vocal about. Okay, but let's assume that that was the intent of the Constitution for a moment and see what is the other side of the coin. It was a hope and belief that people who are qualified to understand the Constitution and also have the larger picture will do what is right and necessary. Unfortunately, that hope and belief has not always played itself out to the best of Indian interests or to the best interests of democracy. That is why you need a revisitation on the NJC judgment and see if the previous structure was unacceptable, what is the other structure that will now be acceptable to the judiciary? Because the judiciary cannot be a law unto itself, which is what it is today. Okay, that is where the problem starts as far as the fetters of the democracy is concerned, because that body has a right to create new rights today. Okay, and to put new fetters on existing rights. Okay, so as long as that issue is not addressed, respect for the constitution will mean merely respect for what the Supreme Court says and not what the original intent was, which is an extremely dangerous position to be in. Because now what was the original intent has now changed to an intent as viewed by the Supreme Court, and that becomes the law. So these are the three issues.
So if I was to understand from what you're saying is then, so would I be correct in saying that the words that are used every time, the basic structure of the constitution, every time we have this discussion, whether it's on Twitter, whether it's on mainstream media, everybody drops this bomb, basic structure of the constitution bomb, I call it. So from what I have understood from what you're explaining is that even the so-called basic structure of the constitution is kind of up for grabs and for debate then.
Yes, of course, it is.
So if that is the case, then I come back to the circular part again. Then what is sacrosanct? Then what is sacrosanct? Then other than the point that we are a democracy and we have certain fundamental rights, which in case of our country, as I stated, the example of free speech, we don't even have that. So other than that, that stamp that we like to call ourselves a democracy, and we are a functioning democracy. Yeah, we have problems. Okay, I accept that, but we've done a decent job. Other than the little blip we had in 1975, where Indira Gandhi got very emotional, and she tried to destroy, and we punished her rightfully so. But my point is, then a person like me, and then to couple this with being literally at the whims and fancies of us, a club of sorts, a club of I don't know, self-declared intellectuals or moral arbiters of the society, whatever word we want to use in this case of the Supreme Court, with due respects to the lordships. But it worries me. Then what is the role of the legislature in the democracy, Sai?
So do you have my article in front of you?
Bilkul, I have it open right now.
So there is a paragraph where I specifically speak of what is it that you must be essentially protecting in the constitution, where I say that in a constitutional democracy you essentially protect the constitution and democracy. Okay, and those institutions which are necessary to preserve its identity as a constitutional democracy, then you're supposed to protect the integrity of the country, the sovereignty of the country, okay, and the identity of the country. These are largely the goalposts which the constitution is meant to protect. Now, if the constitution is so fluid and it keeps moving, what are you exactly protecting in the constitution?
Exactly.
Okay. If it is such a breathing document and it is so fluid, and that even what is being carved out as a basic structure by the Supreme Court is also up for grabs, as you rightly put it, then what are we exactly protecting? Okay. Now, this, I must say, is not something that can be decided by one generation for all generations. That is precisely the point. Okay. This generation may identify certain things which it believes are sacred and therefore must be protected by the Constitution. The next generation may not agree with it. Okay, and that doesn't in any manner expose the problem with the idea of a constitution or its weakness, but it actually establishes its very purpose, which is that each generation has the right to decide what it wants to do and what it believes are worth protecting. Okay, can you prevent a situation where the world has become truly globalized in every way, that national integrity or territorial integrity is not seen as something that is basic to the constitution by a future generation? That is possible.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know whether it is desirable or not, but it could end up being possible.
Yes.
Okay. Then what do? There's nothing that you can do about it. Okay. Today, fortunately, we live at a time when the concept of a nation state or a political unit such as a state is still deemed relevant. Okay, and the problems that the world is seeing are only reinforcing the need for a sovereign country or a sovereign state which has the right as well as the duty and the power to protect its own people. Okay, but in the future, if that need changes and the situation changes and the status quo is completely altered, there's nothing that you can do about it. Okay, so all we can do is to discuss what is worth protecting in our life and times, and how do you hope that the Constitution protects it. Okay, and you can perhaps think of 15 years ahead or 20 years ahead or even 50 years ahead, but beyond that, I think with what is happening with technology, with the manner in which lifestyles are changing, the manner in which attitudes are changing, you cannot control the future the manner in which you want to. Okay, the basic structure doctrine was perhaps an attempt, perhaps a noble attempt, to control the future. Okay, but today it is holding us back. Okay, it was meant to be a check against a brute majority in the parliament. Okay, but it also means that it is a check against the will of the people which support that brute majority for a certain change which is deemed necessary, a civilizational necessity. Okay, so we must simply treat it as a document which protects the values of the current, of the present. Okay, with some amount of reverence to the past, because it believes that we have inherited a few things, and also hopefully understand what needs to be done for the future. But beyond it, it cannot control future, because see, there's one thing, and this is very, very important. History is vastly superior to constitution. That is how it has always operated. The march of time and history cannot be prevented by the constitution. Okay, and the constitution can only ensure that it is bloodless, that it is peaceful, that the transition is equitable, and it is fair. It can try and do so, it can act as a filter. But if the constitution itself is a creature of history, can it hope to stop and prevent history? That is what most of us are trying to do. Okay, the concept of a constitution is relatively recent, it is relatively nascent. But human movements and human aspirations which drive history are much more powerful. That is a fact. And that is something that we always forget, because when we discuss the constitution, that becomes the universe. It is not a universe, it is part of a larger universe, the larger universe being time and history.
This is actually a very deep problem. Then what you're suggesting is actually that you have to look at it, and to use Peter Singer's language here. Peter Singer, for people who don't know, is actually a very renowned philosopher from
Yes.
Australia. And Singer always talks about the expanding moral arch, where the moral arch is going to go on expanding, where we he spoke from the point of view of a Judeo-Christian Abrahamic civilization, where a Judeo-Christian, I'm just giving an example here, a Judeo-Christian ethic was that human beings are unique and special. God made them in a very special way, so they were basically higher up in the hierarchy of importance when it came to the overall evolutionary game. And that's why a lot of justification has been given by those cultures and civilizations in the past for conquest, or even food lifestyles, food habits or food lifestyles,
Right.
etc. And with Singer coming in and saying, the moral arch is expanding, we need to change our ways. Interestingly, in a civilization like ours, where we are such a confusion in that sense, because there are multiple schools talking about multiple things, and this is not necessarily a part of your article, but it is in pertainance to your article, that if there could be the Jain Syadwad worldview, where we can look at it from a 7-point doctrine, where it is not, it is indescribable, it is not, and is indescribable. And then you can look at it from the Buddhist point of view, and then we can look at it from a Vasudeva Kutumbakam point of view, which is called stupid in our own scriptures. So in a case like that, so what you're basically saying is that, look, what we have right now, and I could then put it on the status of free speech in India too, then, that what we have right now is a sort of agreement between people that the subject is not important. If it becomes important, we'll deal with it. So would I be accurate to say that?
So, to build on your point, and to answer your question, if the constitution were to be treated as a smriti, in the dharmic way, because that is the civilization that we have inherited, then the smriti keeps changing with time. Okay. And point number 2 is, uh, if you were to interpret this document as a consequence of Indic civilizational ethos and not Judeo-Abrahamic ethos, okay, to tie it down to a certain point would defeat and would be antithetical to our fundamental belief system. Okay, a civilization that believes in Yuga and Manvantara cannot be tied down by a document called the Constitution. Okay, and that document is meant to keep pace. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is, I don't think today all of us agree that the fetters on free speech as they exist today are correct. Okay, I think it is perhaps waiting for a certain prime mover or certain trigger where again this issue comes up for judicial review or legislative amendment. Okay, I don't see it happening through a legislative amendment because I don't think the dispensation still has the civilizational confidence to do what is necessary. Okay, therefore, there is that effectively leaves us with only one option, which is to knock the doors of the judiciary, to try and remove these fetters which stand in the way of truth and reconciliation. Okay, so I will never treat a status quo as validity of its or let's say proof of its validity. Okay, अगर है तो होना चाहिए, that argument would be wrong. Okay, अगर है तो सही है would be downright stupid, because if that's the argument, then none of these practices like sati or whatever it is should have ever been interfered with, because they've been around for whatever frequency or for whatever period of time. So is cannot become proof of what is correct. Okay, and that is where we make so many mistakes. So in this recent controversy about the minority appeasement policies, okay, somebody ended up saying that, oh, we have had these policies since 2006. What is the problem if the government were to simply build on it in 2019 and come out with a further telescoped policy? Arey bhai, you have been arguing against it for all these days. How does that particular argument and position change out of the blue all of a sudden? You continued to make that argument until the 22nd of May 2019. It can't change after the 23rd of May 2019. And at least give a better justification than saying that आज तक था तो इसके बाद अगर होगा तो किसका क्या बिगड़ जाएगा, किसकी नैया डूब रही है. That argument I think is not right. Okay, I hope that answers the question.
All right, so then in that case, and if a constitution is just basically a document that is a sort of a loose agreement, if not even a loose agreement, a kind of a compromise, if I was to use the word, a compromise of the existing dispensation, then what worries me is that that document is under the constant threat of a demographic dividend, that when there is a sufficient number of people in a demography that basically reject the idea of the only non-negotiable that you and I have been able to propound over here, which is of a democracy itself, then that concept dies. So don't you think having some safeguards to ensure at least that basic non-negotiable have to be thought about?
Right. I think it's a very, very profound question, and there's a recent chance that you may have touched upon quite a few things without knowing it. So, or in fact, without intending it. If the moment I pointed out, you'll realize that perhaps that's what you meant, which is demographic balance and its relevance for our survival as a plural democracy, constitutional democracy. Okay. And when I say demographic balance, I don't mean sheer numbers where people put down their religion as so and so, but in their mind space, do they really believe in those values? Okay.
Yes.
So let's call it ideological demographic balance. Okay. And only as long as the Indic ideology has the upper hand when it comes to the demographic balance, okay, and Indic values continue to be the majority, it is possible to safeguard the concept of a constitutional democracy, because it is only the concept of dharma which effectively ensures equality for all, respect for nature, and also does not see republicanism as a threat to the concept of dharma. In fact, it sees it as a way of reaching out to more people, okay, by consensus, by swadharma, by swadhyaya. Okay, so that is perhaps why I think when we speak of demographics, it's not just about access to resources. It's not just about outcomes in electoral processes. Okay, they are important. They matter. But in the larger run, the question is our survival as an Indic civilizational democracy, constitutional democracy, okay, is contingent on that demographic balance being in favor of an Indic civilizational identity. Okay, any ideology which rejects this particular concept and is antithetical to it, looks down upon it, spits on it, looks at it with contempt and disgust, the moment it has the upper hand, you can bid your all your discussions on constitutional democracy a fantastic and eternal goodbye.
Yeah, that's true. And that's why, when you were talking about it, that's the first thing that came to my mind was Karl Popper and his paradox of intolerance. That, can
Right.
we tolerate the intolerant? And
Correct.
if in your understanding that is all the democracy is, then it is an out and out numbers game. That's all it is. If you don't have the sufficient number of people who, to use your words, in their mind space, if they don't agree on this non-negotiable that democracy is the best way to govern people who are so plural and so diverse in this day and age, and then somebody comes and tries to superimpose and they just stop buying this idea, that we are in a lot of dangers. And the irony of it is, I mean, I look around and I see there is a certain dispensation which I would like to call the left wing of India. They keep fear mongering about democracy khatre mein hai, and the non-left keeps fear mongering about, without saying democracy khatre mein hai, implying that democracy khatre mein hai actually mein. I think the
Right.
non-left needs to be far more clearer, and I think if both sides agree on this basic non-negotiable to start with, that look, we might have all our differences of opinion and we might have our disagreements on many things, but the one thing we can agree on is that we want to all live together and have our disagreements under the rubric of democracy. So if we want to create that atmosphere where we can actually make this message across to our ideological counterparts, do you have any suggestions for that?
You're proceeding on the assumption that the other side believes that you have a right to exist and that your point of view is worthy of respect and is worth engaging with. Okay, that's where I think we are perhaps mistaken. They don't give us the same respect that we even give them. According to them, we must be wiped off the face of the earth. The left, wherever it exists, believes that its way is the only way. In fact, that is perhaps the most monotheistic ideological persuasion that one can come across after faith, after certain faiths. Okay, so there is no difference between them and rabid militant monotheism and iconoclasm. Okay, the left is a creature of that. Okay, second is notwithstanding all our esoteric discussions, the fact remains that democracy is a game of demographics. Second, if somebody thinks that the constitution can resist any demographic imbalance, okay, sorry, even judgments in the Supreme Court is a question of numbers, majority, minority. That is how it operates. So if you bring in a larger bench, then everything can be changed. It depends on the composition of that particular bench and their ideological persuasions or their interpretations of constitution. So when reduced to its most practical terms, it is a question of numbers, which is why you need to have numbers on your side in terms of the number of people who think that the dharmic civilization can survive only if it has enough number of people who believe that the constitution is a product of Indic civilizational ethos. But if somebody believes that we were the lesser civilized people who had to be civilized by a document which has Judeo-Abrahamic foundations, then you have bought the premise that we are an inferior people and we must be civilized and our souls must be saved and harvested. That is the basis of the Indian version of secularism, which facilitates proselytization, okay, which encourages proselytization. at every level, at an ideological level, at a social level, at a religious level, and at the political level. Okay, so all this discussion is possible only when you're secure about numbers. That is a fact, and you cannot run away from it. There is not a single philosophical argument that can withstand the pressure of numbers.
So I think the real battle, if I was to extract, because we've almost reached the hour mark now, and it's always fascinating to have a conversation with you. So just to close things down, so I just wanted to extract something. So if I was to extract the core message from your words today, is that all of us, who love our civilization, and I as an Aztec love my civilization as much as an Azteca does. I mean, I am a proud product of this civilization. We need to fight for Indian pluralism through constitutionalism in that case. And to protect this pluralism, we need to get certain freedoms which we don't have in this country right now. So if I was to close this discussion on the value of constitutional democracy, which and while we don't romanticize it, which was so beautifully put by you in the article, it's still worth fighting for. And if I was to ask you this last question, then how can I and everyone who watches, who's going to watch this and listen to you, what would your advice be? How do we go about fighting for these plural values, and how do we protect this pluralism through constitutional democracy?
By realizing that the Constitution is a product of Indic civilizational ethos. That's point number one. And therefore, every value and every concept in that document must necessarily be viewed through the prism of Indic civilizational ethos and not through an alien lens. If there is a concept which is worth adopting and implementing in this country, please go ahead and do it. But English law itself says that when foreign principles, or let's say common law principles of England, are applied in India, they must be fashioned and tailored to meet the local circumstances and requirements and conditions and customs. Okay, so every concept must go through the process of not Indianization, Indicization, because India is Indic identity first and foremost. Thanks to Article 1, we are Bharat and first and nothing else. Okay. So whenever we have a discussion, I think the goalpost must be to ask, is this consistent with our civilizational ethos? And therefore consistent with the concept of dharma. That's it. Okay. And if that question is answered in the affirmative, then the policy goes ahead. If it does not, then it has to be shot down. As simple as that. Once this realization is internalized and broad-based, then you will have a much better discussion which asks itself, what are the solutions possible within this particular framework? Okay. But if you reject the civilizational basis of the document itself and see it as a foreign civilizing exercise, then we will effectively pave the way for deracination, and as a consequence of it, Bharatiyata, or the Indic identity, will be undermined in the long run. This is all I have to say.
All right, cool. So guys, as you've gotten it, somebody in the live chat said बच्चे पैदा करो. वो साक्षी महाराज का दोस्त होगा. So I couldn't control myself. That was the last comment I saw in the live chat. I was like, wow, wow, wow. Kya comment mari hai logon ne. Obviously, it was in a jovial nature. Right. But this is a very serious issue, guys. And I when I read this article, I was like, kam se kam koi to hai, at least Sai is there out there, discussing these issues. I was so happy that somebody observed what Narendra Modi did when he bowed down to the Constitution. I think most people did not even realize it. And to a certain extent, it also says a lot about the discourse in our country, to be very brutally honest. And I'm glad to have this discussion, because when I created this podcast platform, it was for these kinds of discussions. It was for these kinds of, people can say this is intellectual masturbation, but let me tell you, if we don't masturbate intellectually, we will not even have a civilization. So that is equally important. And Nimish, who has basically through the super chat said he's a big fan of yours, Sai. So thanks a lot for the super chat, Nimish. So on this note, I would like to close the podcast. And like always, Sai, it was a pleasure to talk to you. You are a breath of fresh air in Indian discourse. And I say this not because you're my friend. I say this as a person who has a lot of hopes and aspirations from you at a personal level when it comes to fighting a lot of these battles. And I know सब लोग तुम्हारे को ही outsource कर देते हैं ये सब चीजें, but हमारी हालत इस समय ये है कि एक ही आदमी है, उसके पीछे सब जा रहे हैं. But really, from the bottom of my heart, thanks a lot for coming and having this discussion with me.
No, thanks a lot. In fact, you give your panelists so much of an opportunity to speak that it's refreshing, because most of the time we are cut, we are interrupted, we are edited out, and we are excised. So thanks a lot for giving the opportunity, and I'm grateful to everyone who's actually listened to your podcast. I would request everyone to follow every discussion that happens on Cārvāka podcast. I'm not saying this because this is some kind of a mutual admiration club, but there is at least a handful of people who want to elevate the level and quality of discourse in this country on such serious issues, and I see Kushal as one of them. Thanks a lot.
All right, guys, take care, and I'll see you on the next podcast next week. Till then, take care. Namaskar. Goodbye.